Hello, folks. Just before we get into today's episode, I want to invite you to the next Unreasonable Connection, which is we talk a lot on this podcast about finding the others and being seen. And Unreasonable Connection is a highly informal online event where we divide people into rooms of 3 or 4 people and you just chat over what is happening in your co-working space. You can talk about the weather if you like, but I advise you to make use of this valuable time with peers. There's no sponsors, there's no pitches, there's no, £10,000 cruise to buy. It's just conversations and connecting, and we do it every month. And it's open to anyone who owns or runs a co-working space anywhere in the universe. Link in the show notes. Now let's get into the show.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Coworking Values Podcast. On our call today, we are talking to Aidan Sunassee. Aidan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, of course. Thank you, Emily. Hi, my name is Aidan Sunassee. I'm a psychology and sexuality researcher, certified sexologist, and I'm a copywriter and translator at Cobot co-working software.
Aidan, what part of the world are you in today?
I'm in Germany.
Is that where you work with Cobot?
Yep, correct. That is where I work with Cobot.
So you've written about being neurodivergent yourself and how that shapes your perspective in co-working spaces. Can you tell us some things about your personal journey in co-working environments and what inspired you to write the article that we will share in the description?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've actually only worked in a handful of co-working spaces myself, but I have spent years just working in cafes, libraries, anywhere with that, I guess, quiet hum of other people getting things done. And I do very much enjoy that energy of shared focus. And what I learned early on within that is that the space itself kind of makes or breaks whether I do want to come back. And some places leave you drained after 2 hours. Others make you forget the time even exists because everything just works with your brain instead of against it. And it's often the difference. So the way the environment shapes not just productivity, but whether or not you feel welcome in the space. That's what pulled me into thinking about inclusivity in co-working. It's something that's also very personal to me, but I'm sure we'll get into that very soon, Emily. And yeah, it's having spaces that just make the difference between, oh, I got through today and it was fine, and I actually want to show up here again. And that's why I try to help, and that's why I try to help spaces create for other people.
I've actually never found a co-working space that I found quiet enough to work in, and I've looked. I've looked really hard, so I totally get that.
Hmm.
In your article, you mentioned getting really good at finding the quietest seat in any co-working space. Can you walk through what that's like and how you find that spot?
Yeah, so it's a weird skill to acquire. It sounds kind of funny until you realize it's a full blown skill set at this point. I can walk into a new space and instantly just clock the hum of the fridge in the background, or the reverberation of somebody's phone call, or the light flicker you can only see weirdly out of the corner of your eye. And I feel like from my own experience and from the people I've talked to and worked with, neurodivergent people often become weird human decibel meters, to put it funnily. And what that taught me is that the gap between how spaces are designed and how people actually need to work, it's generally it's massive. And a lot of people love open spaces or just loud of gathering spaces where a bunch of people crowd together, and a lot of people's nervous system just do not like that, do not tolerate that just as well. And that's kind of the reality of most offices I've walked in, and a lot of times I just have to try to navigate to the back and find the best possible place to settle in and get some stuff done.
Yeah, I feel like industrial design has really ruined that for people like us.
Oh, definitely. The big spaces, the huge LED lights, everything just blaring and bright, huh?
Yeah, and the echo, and there's no sound insulation, and it just
So
feels
great.
like you're in everybody else's lap. And no quiet place to take a call, and that's for everybody, not just neurodivergent people or,
Yeah,
you know.
I would think that would be a necessity, but it doesn't seem like everybody shares that opinion, funnily enough. But huh.
Yeah, perhaps it has something more to do with the cost of starting up a co-working space. The furnishings tend to be pretty minimal and easy to clean, and
Absolutely.
To be insulated, sound insulated, you need a lot of cushioning, drapes, those kind of things. They have to be maintained and cleaned. And I get that. I
I
do
can
get
totally
that.
understand it. Yeah, there's always barriers to certain things and how much you can do for a specific cause, and that's something I'm very much understanding of. But a lot of the time, even if it's not a fully insulated space, just having a little room on the side where somebody can retreat or take a phone call, it'll take 5 minutes to calm down when there's a lot of people around, and I think it's something that can often be arranged.
Right. Now, when it comes to queer supportive spaces, you
Right.
mentioned in your article that it's easy to slap a rainbow sticker on the door and just call it a day. But what's the difference between performative inclusion and genuine support?
I would say a lot of the time you can tell when you've crossed into something that's very much marketing strategy oriented because suddenly, you know, there's a rainbow sticker just slapped on something just because it's June. There's every single queer member that becomes content just because it's Pride season, and it's very much, let's say, seasonal spotlights with very specific timing and no follow through. And I absolutely understand that's something that I've written about previously as well, that Pride season month is often the time where all of the spotlights are on us, are on queer people, and I understand that this is the time very often to, really crank up the advocacy and put it out there. That's not something I deny in any way whatsoever, but what I do want to really hammer in, the point I want to hammer in, is that the follow through after that is very much important. Celebrating the diverse members during a time that's dedicated to celebrate us, that's not the problem. It's about celebrating them for optics instead of the actual impact that we're trying to make. And in that case, the fix is relatively simple. It's make it about the work and not just the diversity. And if a big pride campaign or a big diversity campaign, whichever part of the year, if we just make this one little isolated event, if it does not translate into policy changes or actual structural inclusion throughout the year and the years after that, then it's just relatively decent branding and it's not a move towards inclusivity.
Right. Another thing you mentioned in the article is that queer folks also become part of a marketing strategy rather than part of a community.
Hmm.
What is the fine line there between just being part of the community and which occasionally you're called out to make sure that your needs are being met rather than a marketing strategy?
I would say that. And again, going back to the article, as you mentioned, I didn't mention the concept of there's nothing really about us without us, so nothing about queer people without the queer people actually involved in creating those policies or those events that is supposed to celebrate them. So a lot of the time, it's very much about directly asking them, okay, so what makes you feel most supported? What makes you feel like you have all the resources to feel safe and to feel comfortable within that space? And investing more in making the people in your space comfortable rather than screaming off the rooftop that your space in a space is a space people can feel comfortable in.
So when it comes to helping people feel comfortable, and we're looking at the language that people use, especially when it comes to pronouns, a lot of people who are just becoming accustomed to that or who aren't quite sure how to approach it, they can feel like it's a really really big deal if they
Mhm.
say the wrong word or misgender the wrong pronoun, whatever it may be. All of the trans people that I know, trans and queer people I know that have alternate pronouns or non-obvious pronouns
Mhm.
are very easy about this because they don't want a huge spotlight put on it. They just want to exist.
Absolutely.
How do you see that playing out in co-working spaces? Who gets to decide what language is appropriate in community guidelines? How do you share it with the community?
I think there's a very simple baseline when it comes to the topic. It's respect what the person wants to be called. I absolutely do understand that some people aren't exposed to certain languages or to certain ways of addressing people if they see a set of pronouns that they haven't even heard of before. I know a lot of people that have never used they them pronouns previously and met somebody who does use they them pronouns. And the best reactions I have ever seen is even if they do misgender them at the first go, they get corrected and they go, "Oh, my bad. I'll keep that in mind for next time." And that's all that really has to be done. There's no crazy apology that's needed. It does not need to be performative. And a lot of the time, if they want to learn more, they can absolutely ask, "Is this is this something that I can ask you about? Are you comfortable with that? The worst answer they can get is a no, and then there's the beautiful land of the internet they can educate themselves on. But with all that said, at the end of the day, if you misgender somebody, you can simply go, oh, my bad, and go about your day. And next time you see them, you use the correct pronouns, you use the correct name if for some reason you've slipped up on that if you knew them before. And the policy in itself should reflect that need to respect people's identity, respect the way they want to present themselves. And yeah, at the end of the day, it's a very individual approach that does encompass every single person involved within that community, whether it's a co-working space or elsewhere.
Right. And you mentioned nothing about us without us, one of the things you said in your article. And when you center the disadvantaged group in conversations, not the person whose behavior you want to change, what does that look like for a co-working space operator? Because that can be a little difficult to navigate. They might want to, for example, correct people immediately,
Right.
rather than, just displaying the behaviors they want to see.
Right, absolutely. I do think even when it comes to co-working spaces, modeling the behavior is a great baseline, as you mentioned. So just making sure, I've seen people correct other people not by saying, hey, you messed up their pronouns. Absolutely not. Is you just use the right pronoun in front of them. And a lot of the time people are just going to follow through with it. So again, generally, if I am to advise co-working spaces, I tell them to really flip the default perspective. So a lot of policies are a lot of policies are written to manage the majority's comfort, and actual inclusion asks a much different question. It's what do the people most affected by that exclusion need in order to thrive here, right? And that might mean rewriting guidelines from the perspective of the person who experiences harm, not the one who caused it. And it might also mean, for example, building systems where a person who's marginalized or has been marginalized previously does not have to argue for their own legitimacy every single time something goes wrong. There is always something backing them up, or simply saying that the policy here is to respect how people want to be addressed. And again, centering that group is not about silencing anybody else in any way whatsoever. It's simply about making sure that the foundation of the space itself does reflect the need of those who are most likely to be left out if you build for just your quote-unquote average cisgender heteronormative person. And, well, neurotypical as well, getting into that.
Now, when you are designing those systems, and how do you bring people to the conversation in a meaningful way, rather than, a lot of the time it presents as tokenism?
I would say a lot of the time tokenism is, to me, most blatant when somebody invites a queer person into a room, into a space, simply to take off a box, right? So saying, oh, we need to make the space inclusive. Let's just make sure there's a queer person in the group, and we'll just take that off the box. We say that it's inclusive and move on. While meaningfully consulting people that are neurodivergent, that are queer, it's inviting them and being willing to change things based on what they tell you. So the difference here is, does their presence shape the outcome, or just, I guess, decorate the process, for lack of a better term? A lot of smaller places might think that they need a whole full-time diversity hire to do this well, but obviously there's I talked about the privilege of being able to do the huge things that a lot of people might be doing in bigger companies, and not everybody needs to do that. That's not the only route. You can simply compensate a member of your space, or just a friend of a friend who's done that kind of work before. You can compensate them, or compensate a consultant for a one-time fee to just review your system, or just run an anonymous feedback session within your members, or just co-design specific policies that make sure to protect the people that are often disadvantaged by those very policies, right? The key here is very much to listen, to implement, and if somebody is taking the time to share their perspective and nothing changes, then the message you send is louder than any inclusive statement on your website or the big pride flag that you might put on a wall. At the end of the day, it's about listening and just implementing and doing it long term.
So what you're saying is basically that when you're doing this sort of information gathering and you've got your group of people that are giving you feedback, it's not enough to just say, hey, we had a multicultural, diverse group of people come in and comment on the space. You actually have to implement the things that are on that list. Because, for example, I've known authors in the past who have written a book or something, and they've sent it out to a number of different beta readers to get commentary. Then they never implement it. They never look at the comments.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something that they've checked off a list that they've done. They actually aren't interested in the feedback. How can you give an indication to your community that those things have been implemented?
I think a lot of the time, if it's been run through people that it affects, the fact that it's implemented will be visible to the community, because it's been, again, I'm in the research field, I'm going to use the word peer reviewed for lack of a better term. It's almost been like your policies have been peer reviewed, and it's been reviewed for the people that it's going to affect. They're going to walk in, a lot of the time they are going to feel more comfortable. Is, for example, somebody has their pronouns on their Zoom name field, or if simply the concept of having a partnership that is not just a straight partnership is just spoken about openly, or if people use the word partner instead of assuming boyfriend or girlfriend when talking to a specific gender, all of that are things that will often be brought up by the people you consult to make a space more inclusive for queer individuals. And that is something that people will see. It's all of the tiny little things that people who have not experienced that sort of marginalization would not usually think about if they aren't consulting with these people.
Right. I've noticed that people in younger generations are now by default using a lot of the time the pronoun they, them, because it's sort of all inclusive. And then getting
Mm-hmm.
more specific as they get to know a person better, and they get to know, because you don't want to assume just based on, visual markers or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
How can smaller co-working operations with limited hiring capacity, you think a team of 3 or fewer in a space,
Mm-hmm.
how can they do this and still get it right?
Talk to folks, even when it comes to smaller communities. It's very, very likely that if you just pull out a little anonymous form, assuming that you have a bunch of members coming in and out of your space, whether it's just people that are here regularly or pop in and out, you can pull out a little anonymous form and just go, hey, if there's anything we can do to make you guys more comfortable here, we're going to do that. Please tell us. We want to hear from you and make sure people can really speak their mind without that fear of judgment. Simply putting out a statement, like, it does not have to be anything insane. Putting out a statement that's something like, we want to be educated and we want to have the necessary knowledge to be able to welcome everybody here. And all in all, that would be the general idea. And also, when it comes to simply budgeting for what's important for a space, we don't need to take every single staff member, whether it's 3 or 4, we don't need to take them to an entire inclusivity training, but a company can absolutely invest in a couple of books, a couple of resources, or just set aside X amount of hours for folks to just read up on ways to make people more comfortable, on, for example, just the importance of pronouns, reading on different queer identities, reading about neurodivergence, and just putting that time aside to educate themselves. It could be an office workshop for by the folks in the co-working space, leading the co-working space, to the employees, or vice versa, depending on who's most well read on the topic. There's a lot of tiny things that folks can do to maximize the level of inclusivity in their space by educating themselves without necessarily just throwing money out to the wind.
Right. You mentioned that in our pre-call, that tiny things count. Can you give us some specific examples of the small design choices that signal acceptance or exclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, as I mentioned earlier, a Zoom call or just a sign up form that lets you use your name without requiring a whole collection of legal proof that that's your legal name, because a lot of people don't use their legal name. Be able to just show and model the practice of having your pronouns up, whether or not you identify as somebody who's queer, being able to advocate for queer people and making them feel comfortable to just put their pronouns up if you just have them there yourself. I think that's something that has made a lot of people I know more comfortable to just speak up if somebody does misgender them, because it feels normalized, it doesn't feel performative, and it just feels like it's a normal part of the day-to-day work to just respect people and address people the way they want to be addressed. And it absolutely has to be. I would say a lot of the time, space layouts with at least just one truly quiet area, it doesn't have to be a padded call room or a calm down area with a bunch of fancy things in there. Just one truly quiet area intentionally designed for either focus or for people to calm down or to work in a space that's not going to overwhelm them if they're already having a moment of sensory overwhelm within a space. I would say there's also very simple things such as avoiding overly cluttered spaces and using, going back to neurodivergence, using dyslexia-friendly fonts that can absolutely change how accessible the space is feeling. And and the most obvious, let's not mark bathrooms with men and women and not have a gender neutral option at the very least. I personally advocate for just bathrooms being by default gender neutral, but having that option in the first place is something that I often see lacking in a lot of, whether it's co-working spaces or just libraries or cafes where people just flock together to work. And I've seen some co-working spaces with just a simple men and women bathroom signage, and I think that often can be the big first priority that people look into setting up in order to make their spaces more inclusive.
So, can you go a little bit further? One of the things you talked about in your article was sensory zoned rooms and stimulation gradients. Can you define those for us and tell us a little bit more about it?
Right, absolutely. So the way I define it is that every space already has somewhat of a sensory profile, whether they intended for it to have it or not. So everything from lighting, acoustics, and layout, those are constantly sending signals to the nervous system. So treating sensory balance as a core design principle, that means asking, so can people choose the level of stimulation they need for the task at hand? And the sensory zone rooms can create that flexibility. So that would involve having, for example, a more quiet, dimly lit area for people to focus a little bit more deeply, to have a moment of quiet, calm, deep work, and have the ability to just retreat in that area for that purpose. And then we'd have the option of something moderately stimulating. That would be natural light, soft textures in a space that encourages, whether it's relaxed collaboration or just a bit more of a hum, a buzz of, oh, there's people around and we're all working together and really having that sort of body doubling sort of experience. And then there's also the option of having a more dynamic area that would allow for both conversation and movement for people to go back and forth and chat with each other, a little bit more social. The noise level will absolutely be higher in those areas, but they would be designed for it. So building this as a gradient across the spaces would very much reflect the fact that different brains and different work modes require different inputs. And that's very much a functional way to reduce burnout for people by reducing the amount of sensory input they are getting in their spaces. And it helps people sustain focus over time as they can move from one room to the other depending on their own sensory needs.
In our pre-call, we talked about the show don't tell approach to appropriate behaviors. How do you help spaces move beyond just posting their community guidelines to actually living those values?
Right. So a lot of people learn culture by watching it play out. So model learning, as we call it. And we absolutely need, so in order to move beyond those policies, we absolutely need to be creating visible moments of modeling. And I've touched on that briefly before, but for example, that might be a staff member just either gently correcting a pronoun once they know somebody just misgendered someone, or just saying the right pronoun out loud while addressing them in front of that person in order to just minimize the amount of confrontation around the topic. Nobody's uncomfortable, nobody feels cornered, but that correction is verbalized and put out there for people to learn from, and then just moving on without making it an entire scene. It might also be, for example, a manager taking feedback in front of others without any defensiveness in order to really show that it's more of a flat hierarchy within a space, and everybody can just talk and openly express their opinions without fearing a big bout of confrontation, or just fearing that they won't be heard or listened to, and that even the people that quote unquote run the space are willing to receive that feedback or receive that comment of, hey, something that might have been said made me uncomfortable, and simply modeling the fact that I can take that feedback and I can be respectful about it and I can have a conversation about it is something that makes a lot of people a lot more comfortable and allow them to really internalize, okay, well, if somebody says that to me, then perhaps it might be best for me to react the exact same way because that's what I've seen throughout time within the specific space. And yeah, it's definitely how people see staff navigate conflict or corrections in real time. Those aspects of daily behavior, this is the performance that really tells people what is truly valued in the space, and ideally that would be that inclusivity.
Yeah, to quote from your article, the culture of a space is measured in how it responds when something goes off course. So when you are building something better, how do you know when you've achieved real belonging rather than just tolerance? Are there any signals that you can look for?
I would say when it's really handled well, I would take a microaggression or a boundary issue, just for example, those would get acknowledged immediately. The person impacted would be centered, and the norm would be reset without making them just carry the weight, quote unquote, of explaining why it mattered or having to pretty much have somebody, as just to give an example, explain why using the right pronoun would be so important, just explain the whys in the house of their identity, or for example, if somebody uses she they pronouns, not being questioned, okay, well, why both, which one, like, let me do that again, not being questioned as in why both, why can't you just choose one, for example, all things I've heard in a myriad of spaces. Being able to really know that they're able to express themselves and there won't be any weight up in them just for being verbal about their own identity. Now, when it's handled poorly, I think a lot of people, including myself, very much know that feeling. The room goes quiet, there's a bunch of whispers, and the person who was either misgendered or spoken to in a way that might. The person that was either misgendered or discriminated against in any way ends up managing the fallout or just leaving the room altogether or just going quiet and really having the concept of my voice does not matter here be reinforced upon them. And I think the difference in that space, like whether it's working or whether it's not working, whether the training is doing what it needs to do, it's not whether the mistakes happen because they will always, there's always going to be somebody that has something to learn. I can't say I know everything myself despite me talking about this, and neither can you, I'm sure. And that there will always be a person that needs to learn something new or a situation that comes up or somebody has a specific quote unquote flavor of neurodivergency that I'm not aware of. But whether the space treats those moments as an opportunity to either reinforce the values or as a weird PR problem to just smooth over is really going to make the difference. So focusing on that repair tells the members, tells the co-working staff, tells everybody in the space that you are safe even when things might go a little awry, and that you can always talk to us, you can always bring it up, you can always say something, and this is a safe space to do that. The avoidance will just tell them, hey, you're on your own on that one, and we don't want you to disturb the peace by speaking up, and that's what we want to avoid.
Right. Because everybody needs to feel comfortable and like they're a part of the community, not just the people that are in smaller subsections of the population, people who are in disadvantaged communities or who are frequently um, put down in straight spaces.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely, and that kind of reminds me. A lot of people are just like, why why are we focusing so much on queer people? Why are we focusing so much on neurodivergent people? Obviously, because those are the populations that are most marginalized, right? But that concept of inclusivity, that concept of centering how the person wants to be addressed can absolutely apply to every single person involved. I know a lot of people that are cisgender that are just as straight as can be, that are using a specific name that isn't the name on their ID, on their birth certificate, on their passport, or whatever people end up checking in those situations, simply because their name reminded them, for example, a traumatic experience that might have happened to them, and they just decided to go by a different name because it made them feel more comfortable. For a person like that, just having those policies down, that might help them be a lot more comfortable in the space, and knowing that they won't be questioned is something that's extremely comforting to anybody who just wants to be addressed a specific way that doesn't match whatever the legal documents are saying, for example.
Right. We see this a lot in the States, about people who come here from other countries, and they'll have a name that is very common in their native language, but which is difficult for a lot of people to pronounce here, or that they frequently get it wrong. And rather than having a name that they constantly have to correct, which puts them in an awkward position that makes them feel singled out, they'll choose a name that they like. And that's kind of the way I feel about it. Like, whoever you are, no matter what your situation is, you have the right to self-identify. You can pick your pronouns. You can pick your name. That is a right that we all have, or it should be respected at least.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more on that one.
So, if there are co-working operators out there who kind of feel overwhelmed by all this, you suggest to start with a few flexible features. What are the highest impact changes that they can make first?
I would say the most effective changes, those are often the most straightforward. So if you have the physical space for it, of course, create at least one quiet zone that's designed intentionally for focus. That's not just an afterthought of, oh, yeah, maybe you can take the corner over there. If you have the space, make a space for it. Why not? Adding gender neutral bathrooms with, again, full privacy and signage that assumes everybody belongs there. Let's not just say, oh, there's just the staff bathroom. Maybe you can use that, maybe not. Just having a space that's gender neutral for them to just go do their business. It's straightforward and it's effective and it's easy enough to just put up. And integrating pronoun sharing into onboarding and communications tools so it becomes routine instead of just an exception. So none of these really require full remodel or a major budget change, but altogether they do make a difference. They do send a message simply saying everybody's welcome here, having a sign that says that, chucking it on the door. If there's a group of people or a gay couple that's walking up to the space and they're used to being discriminated in certain areas, they just see everybody's welcome here regardless of your gender or sexual orientation. It's an instant breath of relief. The shoulders drop and then they go in and they're just like, okay, well, you know what? Maybe I can just hug my partner on my way out and I won't get any weird looks. And we wouldn't think that those tiny things would really make such a huge difference on people, but they absolutely do. And it really does not take much. It just sends the message of, oh, the space does expect that there's a bunch of different people here, and they all identify differently, and they might have different sensory needs, and they might have different accommodations that they might need. And that shift alone, it really changes how people can experience your community. Again, you don't need a huge budget, you just need the right intention and the willingness to follow through.
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversation that we've had with co-working space owners has been around, like, we dedicate these spaces, but are enough people going to be using them? Do we dedicate all of these spaces? Stop that. I'm sorry, it's my cat. Do we dedicate all of these spaces to just these people who are neurodivergent, or want to feel comfortable in a particular way, some sort of sensory experience that they want? These are useful for people who are not neurodivergent
Oh,
too, who
absolutely.
are straight and, very neurotypical. There are always days when you feel overwhelmed and you need that space, and knowing that your space accommodates that for everyone makes everyone feel included, not just the people who are in these disadvantaged communities.
Absolutely. I can't count the amount of times I've just been talking to somebody and they're just like, ah, I've had a horrible night. I didn't sleep well. I really wish it was a little quieter in here. It's giving me a migraine. Like, that's useful for pretty much anyone who wants a little second or just a pocket of time in which they can get their work done, because everybody needs to get their work done, but not be overwhelmed in the process by everything else going on around them.
How do you recommend spaces gather feedback from all members in a way that feels genuine rather than extractive?
I would say just giving people multiple ways to share. So anonymous surveys, just one-on-one conversations if people are willing to, just open forums, and of course making participation voluntary. I wouldn't say not like really just drag somebody in and be like, you need to give me feedback about this space right now. I would avoid that for sure. But the critical step most spaces miss is closing that loop. So if members take the time to tell you this is what works, this is what does not, you need to show them what you did with that information. Just whether it's publishing an update, even a very small heads up on your website, or directly to them, that's directly tied to their input. That tells them, hey, you told me that the specific type of lighting was really disturbing your workflow. This is the plan we have, for example. It doesn't even have to be, I'm going to change all of the lamps in my space right now. Not everybody has the time, space, or just money for that. But being able to tell them, okay, I'm going to note this down. It's going to be put on the plan next time where just renovating the space, or here we're going to make sure that there's a specific corner without all of the bright lights. And being able to just follow through even on the smaller things, especially on the smaller things that can be easily fixed. Because without that follow through, feedback, just giving feedbacks become a sort of labor that is void of impact. And people will very quickly learn to stop engaging.
If you could wave a magic wand and create the ideal inclusive co-working space, what would the experience be from the moment they walk through the door?
I would say the ideal space is not, it's nothing flashy, right? It's a space that's inclusive in a way that's not performative, in a way that's very much intentional. So I keep talking about lighting because that's the bane of my existence. But the lighting does not fight your eyes. The signage is easy to process. Bathrooms are just designed for all folks. They're gender neutral. They're accessible. People really greet people in a way that does not just slot them into a category. Just like, hey, what's your name? What's your pronouns? Just how can I address you? And the environment would carry that pocket of stillness, or the potential for that pocket of stillness. You can absolutely go into an environment where there's obviously the low hum of work. It's a co-working space. Everybody's doing their thing, but there's no big gatherings in certain areas, and there's areas made for the big gatherings. The concept of being undisturbed while you're deeply focused feels natural and is respected. Maybe there's little signs that you can put on your desk that says, hey, I'm willing to network, I'm willing to chit chat, or I'm focused, I would rather not be disturbed. And it's really a place where you don't have to announce your needs, because the design already has assumed that it might be needed, so it is absolutely there. And the most powerful thing a space can really give is that moment where you feel seen before you even open your mouth. And the second best thing it can give you is the ability to open your mouth and then have your words heard and implemented, and having that feedback loop closed, or at the very least addressed, or being talked to about the specific steps that are being taken in order to make a space more comfortable for you.
Aidan, where are some places that people can find you online if they want to follow up?
If folks want to find me online, they can absolutely just send me an invite on LinkedIn. That's just my first name, last name, Aidan Sunassee. I'm sure Emily will have that written somewhere. So you can just find me on LinkedIn, send me a quick invite with a note or without. I know not everybody has the fancy premium access. I don't either. I'll accept it, and then we can absolutely chit-chat about any of these topics. I always love talking about it.
Nice. Now, for everyone listening, Bernie and I just want to remind you that we have our Unreasonable Connection call every single month. If you go to Bernie's LinkedIn or our site, one of our sites, you can see the invitation to that, and also, of course, in the description of this podcast. That event is a chance for you to connect with other co-working professionals every month, get some inspiration to solve issues in your space. Aidan, thank you again for joining us. I always love having these kind of conversations, and it's been wonderful getting to know you.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you so much.